I think next up, we'd like to hear a little bit from Meg Harvey in terms of the State Department of Health, what their perspective is, and what guidance they are giving the town.
Good evening, everyone. My name again is Meg Harvey, and I'm sure I'm a new face to all of you, but I have actually been at the State Health Department, Department of Public Health in Hartford for 19 years now, working in the environmental health section, and in particular, the unit I work in, we provide really just advice, consultation, recommendations to primarily town health departments, health directors in towns all over Connecticut where there are environmental contaminants, environmental toxins in the environment, and people have questions about public health, about their exposure, about risks. And the unit that I'm in has no regulations. I administer no regulations. There are other groups at the health department that do. For example, the asbestos program has a lot of regulations, but my unit really is scientific consultation, technical assistance to towns. And I know you just heard a lot of chemical names thrown around, numbers, concentrations, parts per million, et cetera. And my goal, hopefully, I will achieve that goal, is to get all your questions answered tonight about what are these chemicals, what do they mean, and I have been working with Sands closely over the past couple of weeks since he first reached out to us to share the information that they had discovered that there was this fill at Gould Manor Park that was not clean soil, and what do we do? What is the best public health approach to take? And the important things to kind of keep in mind, I think, when you hear the chemical names and concentrations, et cetera, and standards, and marginally above standard or below standard, the thing to keep in mind, the most important thing, is the concept of exposure. And no matter what the chemical or the concentration that's in the environment, unless you have contact with it, unless you come into contact and that chemical actually gets into your body, there's no exposure. And if there's no exposure, there's no concern for health risk. So that's kind of number one overarching thing to keep in mind. The second thing is, even if there is exposure, even if you do come into contact with chemical in the environment, in this situation, we're talking about chemicals in soil, if you come into contact with the chemical and some of it does get into your body, yes, you're exposed, but that does not necessarily mean that you will have a health risk or a health symptom. Exposure does not necessarily mean health risk or health symptom or worry for health. In order to get to that point where we're actually worried about a health risk or health symptoms, you have to have enough of the chemical, a lot of the chemical, getting into your body, and that usually has to happen with many repeated exposures over a long period of time to chemicals that are present at high levels in the environment. So going back now to what we know about the condition of the soil that was placed at Gould Manor Park, obviously the data that we have tell us that that soil is not clean soil. That soil has material in it, chemicals in it that are not typical background. Yes, sometimes we see levels of arsenic. Arsenic could be background. Lead, yes, you'd never expect it to be zero, but pieces of asbestos-containing shingles, no, that's not normal. That's not background. And the levels of lead are more than what we would typically consider background. So when we have chemicals and levels, what do we use to compare them against? So the Really the only standards we have, public health standards for soil, are our residential cleanup standards for direct contact with that soil. We don't have standards for parks, for recreation, that type of exposure, that type of contact. So we use residential. Now, we all know that the strip of grass next to the sidewalk at the park is not residential. People are not living there. So when we say the levels of lead and arsenic in the soil were a little bit above our residential standards, that is not a concern at all in terms of health risk, because the way we come up with our residential standards, we assume a lot of soil exposure. We assume young children, as young as age 1, coming into direct contact with that soil while playing in their yard, directly in the dirt, lots of hand-to-mouth contact, that activity occurs 7 days a week, 365 days per year, and the kids are eating a decent amount of soil through incidental contact every day. That type of exposure we know is not occurring at the park. So these are all the sort of the things that I went through in my discussions with SANS and in my analysis of looking at the data. In addition, we're not dealing with bare soil. Grass is a great barrier between people and soil. Just as you know, if kids go out and they're playing in a grassy field, they'll come back with grass stains on their knees. Whereas if they're out playing on a field with no grass, they will come back with dirt stains on their knees. So the grass really does provide a good barrier from that direct contact with the soil. So, numerous conversations, over the past week or so, and my recommendations were that really nothing needed to be done immediately with that soil around the sidewalk, given the type of activity that happens there and the concentrations. But the town decided that they really wanted to kind of take an extra step and be extra protective and really, try to take every action that would further reduce even, the most remote possibility that people could come into contact with that soil. And I think they're going to be doing fencing, I believe, kind of fencing off a little bit to help further reduce any possibility that people come into contact with that soil. And then as we move forward and get additional results from the additional fields that are going to be tested, I will continue to look at those results and give advice and consultation to the town.
Thank you, Meg. So from the top, no one lives at these parks, but children are playing games, baseball, etc., multiple times a week, every week, 3 seasons, a year. Isn't that considered prolonged exposure? Meg, I'm going to turn that one to you, and here's the mic.
Sure. So prolonged exposure relative to our residential standards, no, it's not prolonged exposure. It's still exposure. Playing multiple times, playing on a ball field multiple times a week for 3 seasons out of the year, yes, kids are going to be coming into direct contact with soil, yes. However, compared to what we assume happens in a residential setting exposure assumptions that we make are much longer. Children starting age 1 and living at the same house for 30 years, being in the soil every day, 7 days a week, 365 days per year, all 4 seasons. Those are the assumptions for direct contact with soil that are built into our residential standards.
Next up, my daughter is on a soccer field that's used several times a week. She plays goalie, and that comes covered in dirt, sometimes less, on her legs. If that soil were contaminated at levels found at Gould Manor, should she be concerned?
So I'll give the short answer first. Should we be concerned? No. Why do I say that? So the reason I say that is while, yes, exposure is occurring, direct contact to the soil is occurring, as evidenced by someone who is playing and getting arms and legs covered with dirt. However, the concentrations of contamination at Gould Manor, we know, are low. The arsenic level and lead level is marginally above the residential residential cleanup number. And I've talked already about how that is how we develop that number, what we think about, what our assumptions are in coming up with that cleanup number for residential. So it's not only that we assume a lot of exposure occurs, like 7 days a week, young children with a lot of hand-mouth contact. There's even more protectiveness built into those numbers, because when we develop cleanup numbers, we start with looking at toxicity of the chemical, usually in animal studies. That's where we start out. And then in making the assumption that it's not animals that are being exposed, it's humans, we add multiple levels of uncertainty and protectiveness factors onto our numbers. So that what we end up with is a cleanup number that has a large margin of safety built in. So you might be wondering, well, why? Why do you set your number so low that you wouldn't even be anywhere near a level that could be a concern for an actual health symptom? And the reason for that is because we don't want to have our cleanup numbers bumping right up against an actual effect level, a level of exposure. Let's use lead, for example, where our cleanup number for residential yards for lead and soil is 400. We don't want that number to be so close to a level that could actually cause a child to be lead poisoned. We want that protectiveness because we don't want to worry when the soil level is 500 or 600 or 700. We start to worry with lead when the lead levels in soil are 10,000, 20,000, 100,000, which is what we see when there's lead paint on a house that has gotten into the soil. So that's the reason why I answer that question, no. Please don't be concerned, even if you know your child has a decent amount of soil exposure on a soccer field. Even if those contaminants were present at levels that we know were in the soil at Gould Manor, we have such a large margin of safety built into our numbers that exposure would put someone nowhere near an effect level, an actual symptom health risk level.
I am a parent coach who spends a lot of time on the soccer fields. This past spring, I noticed an increase in kids having breathing problems. Currently, my own daughter, who never had breathing problems in the past, is on 4 inhalers, and when I took her to the doctor, her lungs were only functioning at 68%. How can I find out if her new condition is connected to contaminated soil?
So the contaminants that have been mentioned in discussions about the DPW soil pile and the testing results that we have now from the Gould Manor Park, none of those chemicals would cause those symptoms that were described. So it is virtually impossible for contact with soil on the fields to cause symptoms like that.
Next, in 2016,
Questions that they're thinking about, worried about, that they don't necessarily feel comfortable asking in a public setting. So I have cards with my contact information. Please don't hesitate to grab one, give me a call, send me an email if you have any questions that are still lingering, or if things occur to you after this meeting, I'm happy to discuss any of those with you.